Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is Factors Influencing Public Support for RPSs. This webinar is a presentation of the RPS Collaborative, which is a program of the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. We have an excellent guest speaker with us for today's webinar, Leah Stokes, and we also have with us on the line Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of our webinar. You can connect using computer, mic, and speakers or using your telephone. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console box, you can use the little orange arrow circled there to expand it or minimize it. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. But we expect to have a lot of questions, a lot of people on the line, so submit your question early. Don't wait until the very end, and that ensures that we can get to your question. A final note from me, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a follow-up email within about 48 hours with a link to the webinar recording and slides. And you can also find the recording and other webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Warren Leon.
Hey, thank you very much, Samantha. This webinar is brought to you by the Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a national organization composed of public agencies across the country, mostly state agencies, as you can see from the logos of all of our members up there on the screen. And we engage a lot of activities to share information among our members and to advance clean energy. And if we could go to the next slide, one of the things we do is, Sam, if you could advance to the next slide, please.
Sorry, it's advancing slowly.
Okay. One of the things we do is we coordinate the RPS Collaborative, which is an effort that's funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy to help RPS program managers, folks from the federal government, and anyone else who's interested in RPSs to know what's going on around the country related to RPSs, to share ideas, identify best practices. And we produce webinars. We have the RPS Summit coming up in Washington, D.C. on November 7th and 8th. And I encourage you to look into that and register for it. It's a great event. And we also have a newsletter that talks about what's going on around the country related to RPSs. So if we could go to the next slide. Today's presentation is going to be by Leah Stokes, who's been engaged in doing some very interesting research. She's an assistant professor of political science at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and she holds a PhD from MIT. Her research in general focuses on public policy, public opinion, and political behavior in North America, with a focus on energy and the environment. She's currently writing a book about renewable energy and RPSs. Prior to her academic career, she worked at the Parliament of Canada with Resources for the Future and with the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. Today, she's going to talk to us about the results of a very interesting study that she co-authored that appeared just several months ago in Nature Energy. So Leah, take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be doing this webinar today with all of you. As Warren mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm in the political science department, and I'm also affiliated with BREN, the environment department here. And a lot of my work looks at renewable energy policies. I've studied feed-in tariffs, renewable portfolio standards, net metering laws, and I'm interested in the politics that develop whether these policies are enacted or when they're implemented, how they get revised over time, potentially retrenched or expanded. Today I'm going to talk about a fairly small slice of that work, which is about public opinion and trying to understand some of the factors that could affect support for renewable portfolio standards across the U.S. states. So today I want to talk about some of the context around public opinion on renewable energy and RPS policies. What is the public generally feeling about these issues right now? Then I'm going to introduce to you the specific study that Warren talked about, published in Nature Energy earlier this summer, which relied on a survey experiment. And I'll explain sort of how we did that in specific and how survey experiments work more broadly. Then I'm going to talk about, well, what did we find? What were the frames around these issues that really moved people to support renewables more or less? And then from some of the work I've been doing for my book project, I'm going to just present some frames that are used in practice by advocates and opponents. And these are just sort of samplings, and I'm sure many people on the line have lots of interesting ideas about other cases where they've seen these things used in practice. But the goal here is really to take from the theory that we did and kind of put it into practice so that you can start thinking about how you yourselves might want to be using these frames or countering other frames that you're seeing out there. I'm going to conclude with some thoughts from political science about the role of advocates in using public opinion strategically to communicate what the public wants to politicians. And then there will be lots of nice time left for Q&A, and I'm very excited to hear all of your thoughts about this research or about renewable portfolio standards work that I'm doing in general. So here's some of the context for for public opinion on renewable energy. So this is some data that my co-author Chris Warshaw put together, and he's an assistant professor at George Washington right now. And you know what he did was he went and collected the data from regularly run public opinion polls from places like Pew or CBS or different kinds of polling companies that are regularly asking the public what do they think about different policies. And it just so happens that the most common question that the public gets asked about renewable energy has to do with support for federal funding. But you can kind of think of this as a proxy for support for renewable energy policy more broadly, because you might imagine that the public doesn't really know necessarily what an RPS is or what the difference is between some R&D money or a specific deployment project. So this is sort of a nice proxy for what the public is thinking about renewable energy. And what you generally see, and this is shown in books by, for example, Ansel Beharin-Kaniski, Clean and Cheap, work by Barry Rabe and others, is that there was very high bipartisan support for renewable energy in around 2006 and prior. I kind of thought of this as motherhood and apple pie. If you ask the average person on the street, regardless of their partisan ID, they all really liked renewables. They thought it was a great thing, and there was really high support. However, since 2008, we've really seen a rather dramatic decline in support among Republicans. And so what you can see now is that support among Republicans is about 50-50, down from what used to be about 80 to 90%. So we call this partisan polarization, and we see this general pattern that Democrats and Republicans are moving farther away from one another across many policy domains. You see this, of course, very dramatically in climate change public opinion polling, which you see through, for example, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. But renewables were previously a fairly bipartisan area, and now we're starting to see them become quite polarized. So in this specific paper, Chris and I used a question from what's called the CCES, the Cooperative Congressional Election Survey, which is a big survey that political scientists run during election years, so every 2 years. And it's a very big survey. It surveys about 50,000 Americans. So that's a really big public opinion poll. Usually public opinion polls, if you're familiar with them or have run them yourselves, are something like 1,000 people or 2,000 people nationally, or if you're doing a state, maybe you're lucky to get 1,000 respondents. So this poll at 50,000 is a really, really big poll. And what that allowed us to do is it allowed us to look across every single state without doing any modeling and see, well, what is the public support for renewable energy in that state? And this is just using a specific question from the CCES that just asks people, well, do you support a renewable portfolio standard? So it's a slightly different question than we saw on the previous figure. And when we plot that against where we actually see renewable portfolio standards, which is what the colors indicate. So green states show places where we have fairly ambitious policy, so 25% or more. Blue states are showing where there are binding RPS targets, but they're not necessarily very high, and maybe some of these states are starting to meet or exceed their targets. And then we see in yellow some of those voluntary RPS policies that were passed, particularly in the late 2000s. And then finally in red, we see a lot of the South in the United States, which never passed RPS policies, and also places like Florida, which have really struggled to pass comprehensive policies on renewable energy. And so if you look at this figure, what you might say is, well, we call this congruence. There's a broad correlation between what the public wants and where we see these RPS policies. Generally, in places where support is really high, like in Hawaii or in California, you see fairly ambitious policies. And generally in places where it's fairly low, like in West Virginia or in South Dakota or Wyoming, you don't really see as many RPS policies. So we call that congruence. We say that generally the politicians are doing what the public wants. Now, of course, this does not imply a causal relationship, right? We know from ever taking a statistics class that correlation doesn't mean causation. So this doesn't mean that public opinion caused adoption. And in many ways, that's not the argument that I'm making. Instead, I think advocates are able to construct and communicate public opinion to elected officials if they work in a savvy manner, and that can help to drive initial adoption of RPSs as well as later expansions. So in other words, public opinion can be thought of as a tool that advocates can use strategically to inform decision makers. And I think that's what we see as some of the reasons why we see this broad convergence. So the question that we address in this research paper is, how could different frames, which I mean different ways of presenting the issue of renewable energy and of renewable portfolio standards in particular, how could those affect the kind of public support that we find? We wanted to test that question. And we did this in an article that we published back in late June, so just a few months ago, and it's in Nature Energy. And if people want to access that paper and they don't have access, you're very welcome to email me and I will send you an author's copy. But, you know, we basically tried to understand how could the way the policies are designed, the way they're framed to the public, influence the kind of public support that we see across different states. And we were interested in this because we were seeing sort of patterns that some renewable energy policies were being attacked and weakened. And that's really what my book project's about, that I'll mention at the end. And we wanted to know, well, you know, given that Trump was elected president and we're unlikely to see any really federal leadership on this issue, the states become the obvious place once again for looking at these issues. But instead of seeing ambitious policies, we are seeing that in some places like in California or in Hawaii, but in many other states we're starting to see a lot of retrenchment attacks from the American Legislative Exchange Council and from other groups sort of attacking RPS policies. And so how can we ensure that the public is aware of these issues and that the framing around the way we talk about these issues is the most effective to hold these policies in place and to sort of resist some of these retrenchment attacks? So what we did was what I would call a realistic survey experiment. So a survey experiment in general And if you read this text while I talk, you might get a little confused. So let me just explain it first. A survey experiment is just like any experiment. It randomly assigns some people in your experiment to look at a treatment to see specific information. And it randomly assigns other people in your group to be in the control group, and they don't see that kind of information. And I have a big table which shows all the different random assignment that we did. But we also wanted to really provide the person doing this survey experiment with enough information that they could actually understand what we're talking about. So we didn't just do what most public opinion polls do, which they say, do you like renewable portfolio standards, which are policies that require a certain amount of renewable energy, ? And that doesn't necessarily allow people to understand, well, what exactly are these policies? You know, what are they passed for? Who supports them? How do they affect cost? How do they affect other factors? So we basically created a long vignette that said, over the past decade, many state legislatures have passed these renewable energy laws, and they require some of the state's electricity to come from wind, solar, or other renewable energy sources. Even just telling people the kinds of sources we're talking about is important because people don't necessarily know what the words renewable energy mean. And then we said, imagine that during the next legislative session, legislators are going to consider a bill in your state, and we actually put their state in. So this is an example of somebody who said in our survey that they're from Massachusetts. So that we said in Massachusetts, they're going to require 35% of the electricity to be met with renewable energy by 2025. Why did we pick 35%? Well, we ran this survey about 2 years ago, and you know, at that time, 35% was a lot higher than most states had. A lot of states had been pushing for 33% at that time, and so we wanted it to be a larger target than already existed. So that's why we picked that specific number, just so that it would be an increase for most states. And then we said, where available, here are a couple details about the bill in this particular state, Massachusetts. We then provided a paragraph about details about the bill. And for people in the control group, they wouldn't necessarily see any more information about the bill. So we just say, this is a renewable energy law, it's going to be passed in your state, what do you think about it? Without providing any more information. But in a lot of people's groups, so for groups that were assigned to treatment across these various different treatments, we would tell them information about, well, who exactly is supporting that policy? Is it Republicans? Is it Democrats? How is this policy going to affect costs? How is it going to affect jobs? How is it going to affect global warming, etc.? And then we asked people to just say, do you like the bill or not, on a 4-point scale. So we didn't really let people pick a midpoint there. We said you got to say you support it or you don't support it. So these are the treatments we actually assigned. We were interested in sort of 5 different domains, which you can see on the left-hand side under topic. We wanted to know, how does partisan support affect what people think about these bills? Because we know from a lot of political science work that often the public develops their policy preferences because of what elites already think. So there's a very interesting book by Gabe Lenz, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, who it's called Follow the Leader, and he basically says that the public doesn't necessarily understand policy very much. These are technical domains, it's hard for them to follow, and so what they do is they sort of outsource their decision-making around policies to the elites that they identify with. So Democratic members of the public will look to Democratic elites and see what they're saying about renewable portfolio standards, and then make up their mind based on that. Similarly, Republicans, you know, they don't necessarily have beliefs about this a priori, so maybe they'll look to what Republicans are saying about this and make up their minds based on that. So this is kind of an elite cue. And a lot of people have been looking at the way, for example, President Trump has been signaling on lots of things and how that's affecting what people are believing. And so, you know, I think there's a fair amount of support that what politicians say on these issues can really affect what the public thinks. And then in a third group that was randomly assigned, they didn't get any information about whether or not Republicans or Democrats support it. And so that's the control group that we're going to be able to compare these other groups against to look at the difference in the change. The next thing we looked at was cost. You know, cost is often an issue that people worry about when it comes to these policies. And the first treatment was that it added $10 per month to electricity bills. That's actually quite a high estimate if you know about RPS policies. It's unlikely that RPS policies would increase electricity bills $10 a month in the short term whatsoever. But in the long term, that's not an unrealistic estimate. And then the second treatment was that the RPS would add about $2 per month to electricity bills. And when I say bill, I mean the policy, not the electricity bill in this particular case. So that is the kind of cost that we are already probably seeing with RPSs. There's some interesting work that people are doing to try to understand the cost impacts of RPSs, and they may be higher than we have been willing to admit or understand as a community. So that kind of information was provided to another 1/3 of the sample, and then another 1/3 of the sample didn't get any information about cost, so that we can compare the control group to these treated groups. Next, we did jobs, which is that we tried to communicate around how would this bill affect jobs in the states. You know, especially around the financial crisis, a lot of renewable portfolio standards were justified, whether they were new policies or expansions, based on job creation. This was sort of seen as a win-win, that we could, you know, make the electricity system greener, address air pollution and climate change, and also create thousands of jobs in the process. You saw this, for example, in California with the way that they thought about their RPS during the financial crisis. However, there are other reports that suggest throughout the economy, renewable portfolio standards might not fully create new jobs. This is, of course, a difficult economic modeling question, but you know, it's possible that opponents to RPSs could be signaling that about some of these reports that maybe RPSs aren't really creating new jobs when you think about the net effects across the economy. So how would that affect how people think about the policy? Are they sort of assuming that these policies create jobs, and if they learn that they're not creating jobs, are they going to become less supportive? And finally, a third group received no information about jobs. The next treatment we provide was about sort of harms, so air quality. So we provided information that the RPS would reduce harmful air pollution, including mercury, which is probably accurate, that renewable portfolio standards improve air pollution. And, you know, this is a kind of local benefit of passing an RPS. In the book Clean and Cheap that I mentioned, they talk about the distinction between benefits that affect the whole globe, such as climate change, versus benefits that help people locally, such as job creation and air pollution benefits. And they argue that generally people care a lot more about local benefits than they care about global benefits. So we wanted to test that empirically. Is it true that if we highlight the air pollution benefits of doing these kinds of policies, does that increase support? We didn't have a second treatment in that category, which is why that box is empty. And then so 50% of the total sample received no information about harms, and that was the control group. Finally, a lot of RPSs have been passed with justification around climate change. A lot of people working on these issues are very concerned about climate change. I'm very concerned about climate change. It's hard not to watch what's happening in California with the fires right now and with the hurricanes and not worry about climate change. And so it's understandable that advocates often link renewable portfolio standards to climate change to try to raise awareness about this issue, to create a sense of urgency in terms of acting on decarbonizing the electricity system. So in this treatment, we actually did 4 different groups, and I'll talk you through them since one of them is not on the slide. First, we provided a frame that most RPS advocates are probably using, which is that climate change is a serious problem and that the bill would help fix this by getting an RPS in place. We then presented a frame that a lot of deniers use, whether it's about RPSs or about climate policy more broadly, which is that climate change is not real. It's not a serious problem. The third treatment that we did was we did the frame and the counter frame. So we said some people say that climate change is a serious problem and this bill would fix it. Some people say that climate change is not real, it's not a serious problem, and this bill is therefore useless. So we provided the reader with both points of view at the same time. And then in the fourth group, we provided no information about climate. So doing all these different treatments, and I know it took me a while to talk you through all of these, was a way to actually test empirically, well, what kinds of messages are actually moving people? How can we build more support on this issue? So I'm now going to move on to what we found in terms of the results. So this is a table. You're probably familiar with these kinds of tables. The big circles show the point estimate, so our best guess for the true value. And then the error bars around it show our 95% confidence intervals. And so if those error bars cross 0, the dotted line, it basically means that we can't really tell if this had an effect or not. So to work through the first 3 sets of frames, which were really messages about the policy effects. So the first thing to notice is about costs, which I've highlighted in red as sort of negative things for advocates of renewable energy. Telling people that renewable portfolio standards are going to increase costs, whether that be $2 a month or $10 a month, dramatically reduces support. So when we tell people that they're going to increase costs by $2 a month, it decreases support by about 5%. What I mean by that, as you can see from the bottom of the picture, is about 5% of people move from being in support of the bill to being opposed to the bill when they learn that there's going to be cost increase of $2 a month. What economists would say is that people's willingness to pay for this is not very robust. It's not very strong. That's quite concerning that people are so sensitive to even small increases like $2 a month. If instead we give a larger estimate like $10 a month, you can see that we start to move even more people. Something like 12% of people go from supporting the policy to opposing it. Because like I said, the way we're looking at the axis here is people moving across the line from supporting to opposing. So it's quite a dramatic effect. And this shows that cost increases are going to be potentially big factors to decrease people's support for these policies, and how we message around costs is going to be very important, as well as how we try to minimize costs in the way we implement these policies. The next thing is to look at jobs. As I mentioned, a lot of advocates talked about job creation when they got these policies passed. It was a big justification for doing these policies. And what we see here is that indeed talking about large increases in jobs moves a fair amount of people. It moves something like, let's say, 7% of people from opposing the bill to supporting it. So I think that shows that talking about job creation is a viable way to try to bring more people along. And somewhat positively, when people say, look, we don't know if it's going to create jobs or not. It might, it probably doesn't. At least we don't find that that statistically decreases support. So in general, I think talking about job creation is a win-win for advocates, in that whether or not the studies are totally settled, talking about jobs tends to bring more people along. The next one is about air pollution, and I think that a lot of advocates initially talked about air pollution in sort of the early in the early RPSs from the 1990s. There was more focus on air pollution, but at least in my work, I see less and less emphasis on this. So I think this is a space where advocates can start to think about messaging more on air pollution as providing local benefits to people, talking about asthma, effects on children, effects on the elderly. This is really a way that maybe we can bring more people along. So what we find is when we talk about reducing harmful air pollution, including mercury, we find about, again, 7% of people move from opposing the bill to supporting it. So again, this looks like a fairly viable solution. So I've hit click, but it may not come up yet, so I'll just tell you what we are going to see on the next slide. I'm going to talk about these exact same issues, costs, jobs, and air pollution, but now I'm going to show you how they break down for different partisan groups, for Democrats and Republicans. And if you remember back to that first slide, it's particularly important to be bringing Republicans along with these issues, because we've seen big reductions in their support in the past 5-6 years. So hopefully the slide is now up, and what you'll see here is that across both Democrats and Republicans, we still see very large increases. So it's not just Republicans who become less supportive of renewable portfolio standards when we talk about costs. It's also Democrats. Willingness to pay seems to be fairly stable across Democrats and Republicans. In general, you can see that Democrats are a little bit smaller decrease than Republicans. But the point is, talking about costs is generally bad for everyone. And we need to therefore make sure that these policies aren't increasing costs more than they otherwise could by designing them in efficient ways. And making sure that everybody in the electricity system, not just consumers, actually pays for the cost of transitioning the electricity system. When we do the subgroup analysis, you can see that the error bars get a lot bigger, right? You see how the error bars got much bigger? That's just because we don't have as much sample size when we cut the sample in two into Democrats and Republicans. And so you can basically see here that the job stuff isn't showing up as significant in this case, and that's mostly because of the sample size change. The other thing I really want to point out is that air pollution really works to move Republicans. So when I mentioned on the previous slide that many advocates aren't talking, in my opinion, enough about air pollution, I hope this helps to emphasize once again how viable this is as a strategy, that Republicans in particular are more likely to move when you talk about air pollution. And I think that's because probably Democrats are already thinking about renewable energy more. They probably maybe already assume that it's going to help air pollution because they've read these messages about clean air and clean versus dirty energy. But Republicans maybe haven't been receiving as many of those messages through the kinds of media that they consume, through their elites not talking about it. And so trying to talk about air pollution, I think, is a way that we can bring more Republicans along with these issues. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is the results on talking about climate change as well as messaging about Republican versus Democratic support, so that kind of elite messaging and support. And what people on this call may find surprising or perhaps not find surprising is that climate change in general, talking about climate change doesn't move people on renewable portfolio standards. We don't really find positive results here. You can see that it crosses zero in every case. It's certainly, if you look at the point estimate, that's not negative, so it's not necessarily turning people away from the issue, but it's not statistically moving a lot of people either. And I think what that says is that, you know, climate change is one of the most polarized policy domains, period. If you compare across gun control or healthcare or lots of different areas, climate change is extremely polarized. And that's probably because interest groups who oppose acting on climate change have spent several decades creating public disinformation campaigns. You know, this is documented in the book Merchants of Doubt. And basically, this has created a big polarization between Republicans and Democrats. It wasn't so long ago that you could have found a few Republicans willing to stand up in Congress and actually push forward carbon policies. But right now, this is an extremely polarized area. So what that means is that climate change often works as a partisan cue, and Republicans know that they're not supposed to believe in that or support that, and Democrats know that they are supposed to believe in it and support it, and therefore it doesn't really move people. So I think talking about climate change, unfortunately, isn't really moving people. Now, you might have a different point of view that even if it's not moving people, climate change is a critical issue that we need to be talking about, and that's fair. But my point is, if you want to be bringing more people along for renewable portfolio standards, talking about climate change, talking about these global benefits is less effective than talking, for example, about local air pollution. What about giving partisan cues? What about increasing the voices of Republicans who are pro-RPS? And I just want to say that there are still Republican champions across many state houses who do support RPSs, and amplifying their voices, telling the public about their voices is probably a way that we can bring more people along. Because what you see here is when we tell people that most Republicans support this policy, we move about 5% more people along. So that's a pretty good effect. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you how these effects break down across partisans. So as you might expect, when we tell Democrats that Democrats support the policy, they increase their support quite a bit. You can see that that is significant. And when we tell Republicans that Republican elites, Republican politicians support the policy, they move a lot. You see how big that move is? That's a very big effect. And so I think it's important that advocates start aligning even more so with Republicans in the state houses to amplify their voices and to provide them support. I think you saw this fairly well in Kansas, where there were a lot of Republicans supporting the RPS, and the WIN Coalition was using a PAC to help those Republicans out when they were being primaried and when they were being challenged for supporting the RPS. So it's really important that not only are these Republicans supported in state houses so that they don't get primaried and we get more extreme Republicans, but also so that Republican public members can see that their representatives who are also Republicans support these things. And what you can generally see here is that climate change still as a frame does not work. What's so great about the partisan queue, as one last point, is that telling a Democrat that Republicans support it doesn't decrease their support, and telling a Republican that Democrats support it doesn't really decrease their support. So you're not losing by messaging about clean energy champions that are Democratic and Republican, and really making their partisan affiliation clear to people is probably a win-win. So where does this all, how does this all end up? How do these effects matter? You know, I've just shown you a bunch of survey experiments and a bunch of results, but you might say, well, what does that even matter? How does this affect the politics on the ground? Well, if we remember, if we think back to that slide, and I'm going to show it again, which showed all the different colors for all the different states and where they're at. There are 40 states out of 50 where RPS support, or I think it's probably out of 51 because DC is there. RPS support is 50% or higher, meaning there's a majority of the public in support of this policy. So actually that's pretty good, isn't it? We can see most states, we still have the public, even as Republicans have become more polarized. If, however, we start to message or opponents start to talk about costs and they're able to get those messages through to people, we see that that support dramatically drops. So if we start talking about electricity costs of $2 a month, that reduces support from 40 states to only 27 states, where 50% or more are supporting these policies. If we start talking about electricity costs, the increase of $10 a month, we only end up with 7 states where a majority still support. So the point is, costs are a very effective weapon that opponents are going to be using to try to reduce support for these policies. And advocates need to get savvy in terms of understanding what the costs are actually at for these policies, and trying to minimize them as well, and trying to ensure that all electricity consumers pay for those costs, not just the public. If we talk about increasing jobs, we can see that we bring 8 new states along. If we talk about air pollution, that has the same kind of effect. 8 new states move to majority support. And talking about Democratic support brings 3 states along, and talking about Republican support brings 7 states along. So my point is that starting to use these frames in these states even more so. I know many people are probably using these frames, so perhaps if you're already using these frames, this is going to provide some bolstering for what you're already doing. And if you're not using these frames, this will give you some new ideas about things to start. So where does this all kind of land? Well, where are some opportunities? Here are the opportunities that I see. First, there's opportunities to work in states where support is very high, and the policies are not that ambitious right now because they were passed many years ago. The targets are about to be met or exceeded, and so I highlighted here Iowa and New Mexico, for example. These are some of the states with the highest support for renewable energy amongst the public. And talking about some of these frames would only increase the support even more, because remember, this is just the baseline support. This is not before we started talking about air pollution or talking about Republican support, etc. So I think that those are places where there may be opportunity. Of course, and many people may already think this, there are of course opportunities in states that haven't yet had RPS policies passed. Florida is a place where advocates have tried for many years to improve net metering, to work on an RPS, and it's been very difficult to do that. But as you can see here, Florida is the kind of state where you actually still have a majority in support. It's a fairly high support place, and so maybe talking about the public is a way to keep pushing on that. And the same thing for Virginia. And finally, I wouldn't rule out some of these bottom states. There's many states in the South where RPS policies were never passed, where support is maybe not as high, but these are places we're talking about Republican support, we're talking about air pollution benefits, might really help to get these policies across the line. So how are these frames used in practice? Is this just my academic theoretical thing, or is this actually used? Well, I see these frames used in practice. In fact, the way that we came up with these frames is we looked at what people were doing and we tried to test them. So in Arizona, as well as other states, rooftop solar companies have created a branding campaign called TUSK. You may be familiar with this. Tell utilities solar won't be killed. And Barry Goldwater Jr. is the face of this campaign. It's very clearly tied to the Republican Party. It's tied to ideas of freedom, etc. And that is a way that you can sort of see Republican framing being used in practice. I pulled this off of the UCS website. It's actually not very easy to find a lot of messaging around air quality. This was sort of the closest I could get. It says, stay dirty or go clean. And the left-hand side is trying to provide an image of the dirty, conventional electricity generation, and the right-hand side is trying to provide a picture of that clean future. But I think even more messaging to people that really explains how energy creates asthma, creates premature deaths, creates air pollution. Really connecting those messages home is a great idea. This I pulled off of a bunch of different places, but basically it shows that messaging around job creation is something that people are doing, and that's another way forward that might be working. And finally, this was an ad that was run in Arizona against the APS ads against rooftop solar, and it sort of talked about how energy gets cheaper, it gets cleaner. And so there is messaging around costs here, trying to suggest to people that energy gets cheaper. Whether or not this is true, it depends, I suppose, on how you think about externalities. But we also see advocates using costs in a strategic way. Of course, opponents are also savvy, and they use cost, the most effective strategy that we talked about today, to try to get repeals done or to try to block new policies. So here we see a sort of what we would call astroturfing. So this is not a true grassroots campaign, but in Kansas, they tried to present a view that there was a grassroots campaign that seniors were against renewable portfolio standards, and that kind of messaging is likely fairly effective. And similarly in Florida with Amendment 1, you saw utilities sort of talking about how solar is too expensive, and unless we pass this policy, it's going to be it's not going to be affordable. So they're also using cost. Some other ideas which I'd be happy to hear about during the Q&A that I've thought about, we sort of see it says anti-RPS. That's a mistake. So pro-RPS frames are freedom of choice from utility monopolies, energy security. Those might be other frames that you see the Green Tea Alliance using, for example. Anti-RPS frames that we also see are net metering frames are about fairness and rights, that the way we're treating net metering customers isn't fair. There's also messaging around corporate welfare, which tries to link RPSs or net metering to Solyndra, for example. And there's a lot of this sort of nativism around out-of-state corporations, saying that only companies in our states should be benefiting from this, not out-of-state. So you sort of see jobs here being used as a weapon as opposed to as something to bolster RPSs. I just want to say that in my own research, I've seen public opinion used strategically and very well. Some of you might be familiar with the Texas RPS from 1999. There they did what's called deliberative opinion polling. It's an exercise where you bring a bunch of people together and you get them to come up with, what is really the issue here and how can we best address the problems. And what you found is that after that public opinion exercise, advocates were very strategic. They continuously discussed the findings from that public opinion exercise with politicians when they were reforming the electricity system in order to push renewables and energy efficiency and clean air regulations. So talking about public opinion results can really work if advocates are strategic about it and consistent about it. Today, we know that a majority in most states are supporting these ambitious RPS policies. And so I think advocates should think of themselves as brokers between politicians and the public. In work that I've been doing with Alex Hertel-Fernandez and Matt Mildenberger, we did a survey of congressional staffers, and we asked them, what does the public believe about climate change in your district? Or what does the public think about gun control in your district? And the point is that politicians, as well as their staff, do not actually know what the public wants. They don't know public preferences. And instead of knowing public preferences, they often impute their own preferences or interest group preferences. And those interest groups can be utilities who are potentially opposed to RPSs or net metering. And so advocates really need to be proactive in terms of communicating those preferences to politicians and their staff so that they have a much more accurate view about what the public really wants. Advocates can, of course, also mobilize people. You saw this, for example, in Kansas, where they brought Wind Works for Kansas. They did this. They went to the state fair. They collected all these little postcards. They brought people to the Capitol, and they did a phone call campaign, letter writing campaigns. I know many people are already doing this, but this is just sort of a reinforcement of the work that you're doing and placing advocacy and social mobilization and campaign building at the center of your work, because politicians won't just know what the public wants. Advocates really need to tell them. I just have a few closing thoughts, which is that imposing even small costs on ratepayers is likely to reduce support. This suggests that we need to really work on keeping policy efficient, keeping policy costs as low as possible. It also raises questions about equity. Who should be paying for these RPSs and renewables? Some states have passed industrial consumer opt-outs where they basically allow large energy consumers to not have to pay for RPSs. And, you know, that can be a great strategy to get the policy passed because it reduces opposition, but is it really sustainable in the long term if it causes bills to go up for other people? We also need to be finding and supporting Republicans working on this issue, and I think in Kansas there's some support for that idea and some hope there. And I think that advocates need to be thinking more and focusing more in their messaging about air pollution and jobs. I just want to leave you with one thing before the questions, which is that I'm working on a book that looks at the politics of implementing state energy policy. And I'm particularly interested in cases where things didn't go as well as other places. So I've looked, for example, at California in detail, where it's been a very ambitious policy, but this particular project is looking at policy failures or rollbacks. So I'm examining Texas's RPS solar expansion, the Kansas RPS repeal, the Ohio RPS freeze, as well as what's happened in Arizona with net metering fees. And I just wanted to put this out there because if anybody on this call is an expert in these areas or working on some of these topics, I would love to interview you because I'm still conducting interviews on these cases. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to getting some questions from all of you. You're welcome to email me to get a copy of the paper. You're welcome to follow me on Twitter. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Hey, thanks very much, Leah. And I do have some questions for you. First one I want to ask has to do with whether the reason why air pollution might move Republicans so much more than Democrats is because the Republicans in your sample could have been older on the whole, and they remember when air pollution was a hot topic. Is that a possibility?
So our sample is representative of the U.S. public. So there's no reason to believe that we systematically had older people or younger people or something like that. So I think actually what it is that Republicans, all people like clean air. Remember, some of the bedrock work that was done in environmental advocacy was around clean water, clean air. These are bipartisan issues, right? Nobody wants to be poisoning themselves or their children or their family members or their neighbors. So, you know, I think what's actually happening is that when a Republican hears about renewable energy, they don't necessarily connect it back to air pollution, versus a Democrat is probably already doing that because they've heard a lot of messages from co-partisans about how renewables are clean. So I don't think it has to do with the sample that I'm looking at, but I do think it has to do with sort of the messages that different groups have been hearing about renewable energy.
Okay. This goes back right to the beginning of your report, your presentation, and the slide that showed the change in overall support for federal funding of renewables. Mm-hmm. And somebody asked whether in that survey, were these folks self-identified as Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, or was that distinguished based on voting history? And then also, is that graph available elsewhere with more detail?
So that data is, in most public opinion polls, we ask people what party they're part of. And we can do that in a couple different ways. We can do that with what's called party ID 3 points, which is we say, are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Are you an independent? We often do it with a 7-point scale, which is we say, are you a strong Republican? Are you leaning Republican, etc. And so that was the 3-point party ID. It was collapsed from a 7-point party ID, and it is based on self-identification. So not based on voting history. However, we know from lots of public opinion work that there is a very strong correlation between how people would answer a public opinion poll and how they would vote, with the one exception being that more people say they're independents than, of course, are actually independents. But yes, Republicans who identify as Republicans are very likely to vote Republican, and the same thing for Democrats. In terms of making that figure available, you're welcome to email me and ask me for that. It was made by my co-author, so I would have to check in with him. But it would be great on our end to update that slide, because it's only from 2012, and we could get more public opinion data. And I think it would be really interesting to see what's happened since then for Republican support. But no, it's not generally available. That's just ours. So feel free to email me if you'd like a copy, and I'll look into it.
Great. And did you do any testing of the differences in terms of support for renewable energy in states with vertically integrated utilities versus states that had deregulated utilities?
That's a really interesting question. Of course, there could be things that are systematically different about deregulated states versus not, right? That are not just, like we call that a confounder, that there's not necessarily random assignment there. So if you're interested in that question, what you could do is look back at the slide, the figure, which is also in the Nature Energy article, which shows state by state, where is the RPS in that state, what is the public support in that state, and you could basically just add another dimension, which is it a deregulated or restructured state or not? So I don't really know if there's a particular relationship between those things. I would probably say that you'd have to sort of think about, in general, where you see the strongest support is typically in more democratic states. So you'd have to ask yourself, is there more restructuring in more democratic states or not? And of course, jumping from correlation to causation there is a bit of a tricky endeavor, because it wasn't randomly assigned where we have a restructured state versus not.
Somebody asked about energy security, and they were surprised that you didn't measure that as one of your factors for folks to frames for thinking about the RPS. And first of all, why didn't you pick that as one of the frames? And also, do you have any data or insights into how a focus on energy security might affect Democrats or Republicans' opinions towards RPSs?
That's a great question. It's definitely something I've thought about, as I mentioned in the talk, but you're correct that we didn't test it. Why didn't we test it? Well, as many of you no doubt know, the electricity system and the transportation system are distinct until we have, massive electrification of our vehicle fleet. And so what that means is a lot of the rhetoric around energy security actually doesn't really apply to the electricity system. So we can advocate around those things, but it's not necessarily truthful that, for example, we're going to reduce our dependence on foreign oil or something like that because we pass an RPS. So that is why we didn't test it. We didn't credibly believe that these kinds of policies would increase energy security. Now, does that mean that advocates shouldn't try that strategy in terms of talking about these things? No. Do I have data to show that talking about things in those ways works? No. But what I would say is that advocates or opponents are generally pretty savvy, and they tend to hit on frames that do work. And we tend to see energy security talked about. So I would bet that this is a frame that works, and it probably works even more for Republicans than for Democrats. So I think people are welcome to sort of try that out, and it may be something that I test in some future research.
Yeah. Somebody asked if you could talk more about the impact of cost, because they were saying, well, a 5% decline in support based on a $2 a month price doesn't seem like a lot, because it means the vast majority of people who supported the RPS still support the RPS when a $2 a month cost is put in there. Why do you emphasize that as such a big factor?
So let me try to click back. Let's see how fast I can go. It is a big factor. And it's important as a group not to become kind of complacent and believe that costs won't matter. I think that's an important point, and it's definitely what my co-author believes, even more strongly than I do. But remember when I showed you this figure here? Here we go. There it is. What happens? Remember, we tried to basically take the little marginal change, which this questioner has said it looks very small, which is fair. It does look very small. But if we actually apply that across the states, it's a big enough change to move 13 states from a majority of support to a majority in opposition. So I wouldn't say that's a small effect. You know, that's a pretty big effect, actually, in terms of shifting people. Now, of course, 50% is not a magical number. Having majority in support or majority in opposition does not magically change policy. But I think this really should raise some red flags for us in terms of how can we communicate about the true costs of the conventional electricity system? How can we communicate about fossil fuel subsidies, about air pollution from coal and natural gas plants, so that when we really think about the costs of renewables, we're giving them a fair shake, but we're also not underplaying the amount that they might be adding to the way we produce electricity.
Good. Well, thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of the time, and there's just a couple minutes left. So I want to know if there's anything else you would like to say that you haven't had a chance to say, or anything that you've said that you want to reemphasize.
No, I would just say that, you know, this is ongoing work that I'm working on. I'm very interested in what advocates think about these things. I'm certainly not trying to tell people what to do from some kind of outside perspective. I've spent a lot of time interviewing people who are advocates at the state level, and I plan to continue to do that. So if people have ideas about different things we could try out, if they've been trying these things out themselves, if they want to try to run a survey experiment or a field experiment, I'm very open to doing that kind of work. So I take a sort of collaborative approach to my research, and I'm very interested in supporting advocates on these issues because I believe that climate change is a serious problem. So I'm really happy to hear from people if they want to have further conversations on these issues, if they'd like to tell me about what happened in their state on RPSs, etc. So thanks so much for listening to this research. You can email me for a copy, and yeah, I really support the work that folks are doing to try to decarbonize the electricity system and increase the amount of renewables that we're using.
Hey, Leah, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. And as Samantha mentioned at the beginning of the hour, this will be up on our website. And on our website, you could see recordings of many more webinars and a lot of other information from the RPS Collaborative. So thanks to everybody today for joining us. Bye now.